Hello, fellow space enthusiasts. We all know what happened when Neil Armstrong returned from the moon, don't we? He headed to his farm in the middle of nowhere and became a recluse, right?
The first man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong, right here.
Again, it is a high honor and pleasure to introduce to you Neil Armstrong.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Neil Armstrong.
Here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Neil Armstrong, right here.
Dr. Neil Armstrong, ladies and gentlemen.
Are privileged to have Neil with us today.
Neil Armstrong.
Thank you. Thank you. Very kind. Much appreciative.
Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Armstrong.
The truth is, after leaving NASA, Armstrong didn't take one small step away from his fellow man. So why has he been labelled the reclusive astronaut? When it comes to Neil Armstrong's post-NASA life, the most popular impression of him is that of a shy man who was intensely protective of his private life, and as a result he avoided the public spotlight. This led to the press labelling him a recluse. The newspapers formed this image of him in the decade after his moonwalk, when he turned his back on fame and fortune and headed for a far quieter life as a university professor. One Cincinnati resident summed up what many thought of Armstrong during his time working at the local university.
Armstrong is a hermit. As far as people in this town are concerned, he doesn't exist.
Once formed, the impression of Armstrong being a recluse never left him, and it continued to be used to describe him for the rest of his life. David Garrett, who worked in the Public Affairs Office at the Manned Spaceflight Center, said of Armstrong,
"He's a recluse's recluse. Howard Hughes had nothing on him."
His son Rick, on the other hand, stated,
"The media at that time labeled my father as a recluse, and it's just nothing could be further from the truth."
So was it an accurate description? Let's take a closer look at Armstrong's life following his return from the moon. On the 10th of August 1969, the 3-week quarantine for the Apollo 11 crew came to an end, and they left the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. They were greeted by crowds of excited well-wishers and the flash of camera bulbs. For the 3 lunar voyagers, it was a brief exposure to the hazards that President Kennedy had talked about following the flight of John Glenn.
As Lieutenant Shepard, Major Grissom have learned, and as Colonel Glenn is now learning, the hazards of spaceflight only begin when the trip is over.
Armstrong, for one, was going to do his best to avoid these hazards, and his dash from the exit of the LRL to his waiting car and his subsequent speedy disappearance into the night was just a foretaste of how he was going to deal with being in the public spotlight. Just a couple of days later, the 3 men attended a news conference, and when asked how the crew were going to deal with all of the attention they now faced, Armstrong answered,
"It kind of depends on you."
In reality, irrespective of how the press meted out their demands for his time, Armstrong wasn't going to dance to their tune. Fellow astronaut Richard Gordon said of this decision on Armstrong's part,
"I make no judgment. Neil did what he wanted to do."
What Armstrong wanted to do was lead as normal a life as possible, not only for himself but also for his family. He admitted that,
"The one thing I regret is that my work required an enormous amount of my time and a lot of travel. I didn't get to spend the amount of time with my family I would have liked."
If you had been given an opportunity to fly again, would you stay with NASA?
I suppose I would. Can you make me an offer?
With no more space flights ever going to come his way, Armstrong left Houston and went to work in Washington, D.C. as the Deputy Associate Administrator of Aeronautics.
Neil, if you'd put your right hand on the Bible and raise your left hand, or put your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. That was the previous administration where we raised the left hand.
He found DC a frustrating place to work, and the frequent dinner parties he attended, where he was heralded as a hero, were an anathema to the self-confessed
White socks, pocket protector, nerdy engineer.
After a year of working in the Capitol, he had had enough, saying,
"I think everybody should have to go to Washington and spend a little time, just to see how difficult it is to run this country and do penance there."
He also grew weary of NASA and the government's constant demands to make public appearances. Wishing to free himself of the burdens placed upon him, he left Washington and NASA in 1971 and headed to Ohio to become a professor of aerospace engineering at Cincinnati University. By taking this job, he hoped to step out of the public spotlight, stating,
"It's not that I feel uncomfortable. It's just that I find there's inadequate time to do all the things I'd like to be doing."
Of this decision, Michael Collins wrote in his book, Carrying the Fire,
"He lives in a figurative castle surrounded by a moat full of dragons. When he chooses, which is not often, he can lower the drawbridge and sally forth. But more important, when he chooses, he can retreat with honor and dignity."
The castle Collins spoke of was the farm Armstrong had bought, about 35 minutes away from his new place of work. Not long after starting his new job, Armstrong reluctantly agreed to a face-to-face question and answer session with a number of reporters. It was quite a unique concession from him, but he saw it as a way of satisfying in one go the many requests for interviews regarding his dramatic change in career direction. The press conference took place on the 1st of December 1971, and it touched upon many subjects about his new life, but tellingly, he only talked about the moon once.
Professor, do you ever look up at the moon and have to wonder whether your experience really did happen?
I look up pretty frequently at the moon, as a matter of fact, and I still find it difficult to believe that we were successfully able to carry these flights off, but I've convinced myself.
After this, it appears that Armstrong spent the rest of the 70s trying to put his astronaut persona behind him. His son Mark stated,
"He just wanted to be a regular guy, just like everybody else."
There was just one thing standing in the way of this, the fact that he was the first man to walk on the moon. If he viewed this as an obstacle to him achieving his goal of a normal life, then it might explain why he seemed to distance himself from his past accomplishments and shut down any talk of his moon flight. His philosophy on the matter was,
"It was an experience, one of many. Now I have other things to do with my life."
His friend Fred Lawson said of this,
"Neil never talked about his space flights or moonwalk. There seemed to be an unwritten rule. You just didn't mention it around Neil."
Most students and co-workers at the university avoided the topic, and new colleagues joining the university were advised to avoid talking about his time in the space program, because it wasn't Astronaut Armstrong anymore, it was Professor Armstrong. Even his son Mark recalled how,
"We had a telescope and would look at the night sky. Dad knew all about the cosmos, but he never pointed at the moon. We didn't look at the moon."
As this online comment shows, Armstrong was not overly forthcoming about talking about his time on the moon, and anyone who expected a meeting with him to generate a fascinating recounting of his experiences were in for a disappointment. This reluctance to talk about his experiences is summed up in the book One Small Step by Tim Furness. He wrote of Armstrong that he
gave himself to NASA after the flight for the necessary goodwill tours which he graciously performed. That done, He went back to his Ohio roots and slammed the door well and truly shut, and woe betide anyone who knocks without an invite, especially if they want to ask about the moon.
Eventually the press picked up on this and started asking why he didn't speak about space more often. One reporter asked him,
Mr. Armstrong, your experiences have excited millions of people. Yet it seems like you're kind of bored and even a little resentful sometimes of the excitement other people feel about what you have experienced. Why do you suppose that's true? Why do you think you leave that impression with people?
Well, I can't put myself in your eyes. That's not the way I feel, but if that's your perception, I'll ask you to explain it to me.
It's not hard to see why people thought that Armstrong slightly resented having to talk about his Apollo flight. When asked around the 25th anniversary of his moonwalk if he often thought about it, he replied,
The answer is no, but it gets brought to my attention a lot.
To what level Armstrong expected to be able to remain out of the public spotlight is unsure, but he did say around the 20th anniversary of the mission.
And so it's a great surprise to me that so many people remember something that happened 20 years ago.
During the Gemini program, once a prime crew had completed their flight, the spotlight moved on to the next crew in line to fly. When it came to the first moon landing, however, once the spotlight descended on the crew, it never left them. Collins wrote of this,
Unlike Gemini 10, which ended the instant we hit the water, this flight will never truly be over, in my lifetime.
The three men were in the unique position of having flown on the first moon landing, and Collins thought that this would lead to them supporting each other with the pressures they now faced. In reality, though, Collins understood that the fact that they were all loners meant they wouldn't ask each other for help. They would instead have to deal with their fates individually, and how they dealt with them led to the boxes that the press put them into. Armstrong would be the recluse, Collins would be the forgotten man of the mission, and Aldrin would be the man who fought his demons. Aldrin wrote in his book, Men from Earth,
None of us was going to have an easy time with the public relations part of our mission.
Armstrong would state,
I did decide. I think we all decided that we would accept the penalties of success as well as those of failure.
The penalties for Armstrong came in the form of unending requests for interviews, stalkers, people who would try to exploit him in some way, and just members of the public who wanted a moment of his time for a word, a photograph or an autograph. The trouble was, the more he pulled back from all of that, the more criticism he received. It was also the case that the less he stepped into the public spotlight, the more in demand he became. The battle lines had been drawn, and the divide between Armstrong's desire to get on with his life and the public's and the press's demands for him to speak about his experiences would be an ongoing conflict for the rest of his life. One aggrieved member of the public wrote to Armstrong's secretary,
He is a celebrity not through his own merits but through a public project, which all Americans paid for, and having this status has a responsibility to the Americans.
Armstrong would complain of this public obsession with him.
How long must it take before I cease to be known as a spaceman?
His attitude frustrated many, especially as the space program during the 1970s needed all of the cheerleaders it could find because of dwindling public interest and budget cuts. Fellow astronaut James Lovell expressed his opinion that Armstrong did owe the public some return on their investment. He claims to have told him,
The public taxpayers paid for your trip and gave you all that opportunity and fame, and there is a certain amount of return that is due them.
Armstrong, though, disliked being singled out for the achievement of the first moon landing, and he rejected the hero worship that surrounded that historical position. He also had no intention of being continually wheeled out to promote the space program. He stated,
I don't want to be a living memorial.
Being in the public eye also meant answering the same questions year after year. On the matter of sharing his own experiences of space travel, Russell Schweikart commented that,
Unfortunately, I have to tell the story again, and again, and again, and when you've told the story 1,000 times, you're sick of it.
Over the years, other astronauts have talked about their moonwalks, which has led some to question Armstrong's suitability for the position of first man on the moon. Some wondered if the more exuberant Pete Conrad, the commander of Apollo 12, would have been a better choice. At the end of the day, though, NASA employed astronauts on their ability to traverse space and survive. They did not recruit them on their PR credentials. Conrad simply said of Armstrong's approach,
Neil's entitled to do his thing.
Of course, there's no guarantee that any of the other astronauts would have wanted to have swapped with Armstrong. Schweikart, for one, revealed that when it came to being the first man to step on the moon, he would have
loved to have trade places with Neil Armstrong in terms of the experience, but not in terms of the post-flight experience.
When it comes to Conrad, if he had been first instead of third, then he would not have been allowed to go into space again, which would have meant no Skylab command. If the decade after his flight to the moon was a time when Armstrong was attempting to reinvent himself as something other than an astronaut, it could also be seen as a time when he was reclaiming control over what he did and didn't have to do. During his time at NASA, he had been obliged to make public appearances and take part in interviews and news conferences. Of these appearances, he would say,
"For all public appearances while I was in government service, I didn't have a choice."
His wife Janet would say that her husband was
never comfortable speaking.
But she added that
he did it and he did a great job of it.
Was there ever a moment on the moon when either one of you were just a little bit spellbound by what was going on?
About 2.5 hours.
After leaving NASA behind, such events would, with maybe the exception of when the request came from a sitting US president, only occur when he wanted them to. Throughout the decade after his moonwalk, when he could find the time, Armstrong did undertake appearances in the US, and he also continued his travels around the world. Some of his more notable journeys abroad included going on a Christmas tour in Vietnam in 1969 with Bob Hope, accepting the Gold Medal Award from the Royal Geographic Society in London in November 1970, visiting a small town reputed to be the traditional seat of the Clan Armstrong during a March 1972 visit to Scotland, and taking part in an expedition in the jungles of the Amazon during August 1976 to try and locate a mythical library located deep within a cave system. He also carried out work associated with the ongoing space program. He sat on the Apollo 13 review board during 1970 and also provided some TV commentary during the Apollo 14 moonwalk.
Comment with us here over off Reef Map. Neil, how are you this morning?
Fine, Jules. Certainly enjoying this activity.
Sounds like Al and Ed are having a ball, though, working hard.
Yes, I can believe they're really enthusiastic about the challenge of getting up to the top of that hill.
He also took part in an event at the Johnson Space Center during August 1978, where he joined many of the other Apollo-era astronauts for a debriefing session on the upcoming space shuttle program. The 70s saw him traverse the world, from Australia to Germany, from Russia to France. Everywhere he went, he made speeches, accepted awards, attended events in his honor, and gave lectures at business seminars. As the 70s came to an end, Armstrong left his post at the university and increased his involvement in the world of business. Shedding the stuffy clothes of a professor and donning the suit of a businessman, he continued with the mantle he wished the outside world to have of him, of being a grey man, in an attempt to keep unwanted attention at arm's length. The press were happy to go along with this, and maintained their angst at his lack of accepting interview requests. All the while, he continued with his selective appearances and exploits, even managing to find the time to set 5 world records in a Learjet, and venturing into the world of TV advertising before the decade was out.
Confidence in Chrysler Engineering launches the longest protection plan available from any car maker in America. It protects you longer than any other American car maker's plan.
Of this contradiction, Armstrong later revealed,
"I do not mind that my view of my public intercourse and that of the press do not coincide. It probably suits my purpose better than if we had the same opinion."
The 80s and the 90s saw Armstrong continue his selective approach to his public appearances. He continued giving public talks and exploring the world, even going as far afield as the North Pole in April 1985. As he told a friend in 1997,
"Over the last several years, I have given many public lectures in a number of countries."
He also introduced a series of programs called First Flights.
First Flights.
Hi, I'm Neil Armstrong. Join me for an adventure through time.
And of course, he served as the vice chairman on the commission that investigated the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger.
As the system exists now for significant parts of the envelope, there really is no method of survival, and we believe some additional method of survival is possible.
As the new century began, it saw Armstrong take a different approach to life. He had once said that he would submit to more public appearances
after I cease being so much in the news.
Well, that never really happened, but maybe in his later years he did mellow a bit and embrace his status as the first man to step onto the moon. Jerry Griffin, a former Apollo flight director, observed that
starting around 2000, somewhere in there, he got more available. He was kind of back amongst us. He had served his time and kind of had gotten a little bit, maybe not so full of pressure.
If it was the case that he was more agreeable to being seen at public events, it didn't lead to a change in the press's perception of him, who persisted in labelling him as a recluse, mainly because he persisted in his avoidance of the interview format. He wasn't interested in interviews and their what he called frivolous questions and pseudo-news. He was interested in positively inspiring the younger generation, which is why he enjoyed being at Purdue University and spending time with students. The final chapter of Armstrong's struggle with the demands of being in the spotlight saw him more at ease with himself and ready to face the challenge with a smile. The definition of a recluse is a person who lives alone and avoids going outside or talking to other people. So was Armstrong a recluse? Obviously not. After leaving NASA, he wanted to achieve new goals and avoid just being a spokesperson for the space program. As he explained in later years,
I guess we all like to be recognized not for one piece of fireworks, but for the ledger of our daily work.
Armstrong's dislike of the interview format, which he described as being
cotton candy reporting,
led to him avoiding them as much as he could. He stated,
I am not interested in publicity or being the subject of feature stories.
As a result of his turning down so many interview requests, the press pushed back and labelled him a recluse. Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the moon, has been a virtual recluse since he left the nation's space program. Another described him as a semi-recluse, devoting himself to academic pursuits and his farm, while another said of him, since Apollo 11's journey, he has been popularly regarded as a man so altered by the cosmic shock of going to the moon and back as to have become a recluse. This label stuck with the press, and ever since, whenever Armstrong is mentioned, the word recluse is never far behind. Armstrong wrote of this,
They learned this characterization from other newspaper articles. The primary reason for their view is that I have long maintained a policy of not granting individual interviews and press conferences only when justified by newsworthy events.
Armstrong would always deny the accusation that he was reclusive, stating,
Well, I recognize that I'm portrayed as staying out of the public eye, but from my perspective it doesn't seem that way because I do so many things, I go so many places, I give so many talks, I write so many papers that, from my point of view, it seems like I don't know how I could do more.
His friend John Suez said of Armstrong,
He's certainly not reclusive. He's got a good sense of humor. The first time I chatted with him at length, he was funny and outgoing.
As can be seen in this footage of Michael Collins' birthday on the airplane taking the Apollo 11 crew around the world on their post-flight tour, Armstrong could be just as social as anyone else. From an early age, he had not been afraid of appearing in front of an audience. At school, he had played in a band called the Mississippi Moonshiners, and he had also been in the Purdue All-American Marching Band. Later on, at Edwards Air Force Base, Armstrong had been the lead singer in the high-speed flight station's singing group called the Hi-Ho's, as in I-Ho and Here We Go. The group performed at hospitals, nursing homes and parties. He could also enjoy a joke as much as the next person, so far from being the cold, emotionless character seen in the film First Man. Armstrong had a distinctly outgoing and playful side to him, as he demonstrated during this appearance on the Bob Hope Show.
Neil, a lot of people might not know this, but I should be calling you Professor.
Well, I used to teach and do research at the University of Cincinnati.
Would you like to give me a grade on my monologue?
I don't think so, Bob. I taught aerospace engineering, and I'm used to grading things that get off the ground.
Is it unpatriotic to kick an astronaut in the shins?
Bob, that didn't come out the way I meant it. It was a brilliant monologue. I'd give it an A+.
Nice cop-out. Thank you.
So when it comes to Armstrong, there are two conflicting images of him. He is labelled a recluse, and yet he did take part in public events, such as this event on the football pitch at Purdue University. Any appearances he made were labelled as rare, as can be seen in these three articles about three separate events he attended several years apart, and yet there are numerous videos of him making public appearances. He is described as shy and emotionless, and yet he joined in singing when he was being serenaded by the choral assembly of Purdue University. Others have described him as a man of few words. His wife Janet stated,
"Silence is Neil Armstrong's answer. The word no is an argument."
And yet he could be totally at ease speaking in front of an audience.
Some of us are natural pessimists, some natural optimists. It's often been said, some see the glass full, some see the glass half empty. Engineer sees the glass is twice as big as it needs to be.
The general impression of him is of a self-effacing man who would have run a mile if he'd have seen his name up in lights.
Neil Armstrong.
Thank you so much.
The truth is, Armstrong never did fully retreat to his castle and pull up the drawbridge. He was always making forays out into the world and meeting people. Less than 2 years before he died, he was in Iraq alongside Gene Cernan and James Lovell to share his experiences with the US troops stationed there. He was labelled a recluse by the press, who for once had met someone famous who wasn't interested in self-promotion, fame or celebrity. He didn't need them, because his achievements needed no embellishments. The last words should go to Neil Armstrong, who wrote in a letter to a friend in 1997.
I was pleased to hear from you again after what seems like a long time. Please forgive the delay in this response, but I have been so busy giving public presentations that I am rather behind in my correspondence.
Armstrong signed off the letter, no doubt with a wry smile, with,
"Your reclusive friend, Neil."
I hope you have found this video full of interesting information, and thank you for watching.
Hey, that's great.